They thought the fire was the story.
Good God, the ground's giving way. Get back!
It wasn't. On an August night in 1857, men rowed hard through the dark toward Mercer Landing, a cotton shipping house on the Mississippi just south of Natchez. They came with buckets, wet blankets, and curses in their mouths, expecting to save a warehouse. Then the ground behind the widow's kitchen gave way. What opened under their boots was not a cistern, not a root cellar, not a storm drain. It was a brick passage dropping into the earth. And from inside it came voices. Not one voice, many. Some begging, some coughing, some too weak to do anything but scratch at the dark. The sheriff's report would later call it a concealed substructure containing persons in distress. 6 dry words for a place built to hide the living, until hiding itself became another name for captivity. The woman who owned that house was Adeline Mercer. In Natchez society, she had once been known for polished silver, French hymnals, and winter suppers served under candlelight to river merchants and clergy. By the time the earth opened behind her kitchen, people called her something else. The widow at the landing, the woman who kept her lamps burning until dawn, the one who stopped hosting, stopped laughing, stopped letting anyone pass the front rooms of her house. And for more than 6 years, almost no one understood what she was building below them. To understand how a respectable widow ended up with a hidden harbor of brick chambers under her own house, you have to go back to the winter of 1851. Adeline Mercer was 38 when her husband, Silas Mercer, died during a cholera outbreak that ran up the river with the packet boats. He had made his fortune as a cotton factor and freight broker, the kind of man who profited from every bale that moved, whether it came by wagon, flatboat, or the forced labor of people who would never touch the money it earned. The Mercers did not own one grand plantation in the way planters like to boast about at table. Their power sat closer to the river. Warehouses, contracts, credit, storage sheds, a large brick house at the landing, and business ties that reached from Mississippi to New Orleans, Memphis, Louisville, and farther north. Silas died in 3 days. Fever, vomiting, collapse. By the 4th day, he was in the ground, and Adeline Mercer, childless, educated, and suddenly in control of an operation most men assumed she would hand over to a brother or cousin, did something they did not expect. She kept it. At first, people praised her resolve. She dismissed one drunken clerk, hired a bookkeeper from Vicksburg, paid debts on time, oversaw freight inventories herself. But within months, the praise curdled into suspicion. The shipping ledgers changed. Bales left the landing half-loaded. Invoices showed unusual purchases that had nothing to do with cotton, quinine, laudanum, dried beans, lamp oil in large quantity, rough blankets, children's shoes, iron hinges, narrow pipes, crates of brick from New Orleans, and enough lime mortar to line a cistern no record said existed. Then came the work crews. In April of 1851, Adeline hired bricklayers and laborers from downriver instead of using local men. According to a foreman's notebook later found in a probate file, the crew was instructed to begin below the old wine cellar and work outward under a section of yard between the kitchen and the freight office. The foreman expected 6 more weeks of work. He got 18 days. On the 19th, Adeline paid every man in cash and dismissed them before sunrise. She told neighbors the cellar had settled and the repairs were complete. They weren't. A woman named Liza Boone would later tell a Works Progress Administration interviewer in 1939 that after the hired men left, the work went on anyway. Liza had been enslaved in the Mercer household as a cook and laundress. When she was interviewed, she was believed to be in her 90s and some historians brushed off her memory as old age talking. But the details she gave would match discoveries made almost word for word more than 30 years later. She said the widow moved work underground. She said certain men were called from the yard after dark. A cooper, a brickman, a carpenter who could fit hidden doors. They went below through the cellar and came back up coated in red dust, too tired to look anyone in the eye. Then some of them stopped coming back up at all. The first thing Adeline Mercer seems to have intended was not imprisonment. At least, not at the beginning. That conclusion comes from a packet of letters found in 1974 in the papers of a Cincinnati minister whose abolitionist network operated along the Ohio River. Two of those letters, both written in Adeline's hand and signed only A.M., describe a location near Natchez where travelers could be kept out of sight for several nights before being moved north by freight or riverboat under falsified cargo manifests. One line reads, "There must be a place of waiting, otherwise the patrols will take them before the river can." A place of waiting. That is what she called it before she began calling it something else. The harbor. Adeline's private journal survives only in fragments, but those fragments are enough. In the first entries after Silas died, she wrote like a woman whose moral world had cracked open. She described hearing chains from the holding pens near the docks at night, and no longer being able to recite scripture over breakfast without hearing the contradiction in her own voice. She wrote that commerce had made her house prosperous, and that commerce in this country was stitched inseparably to human bondage. Then the language changed. By late 1851, she was no longer writing about conscience. She was writing about selection. Burden. Appointment. The river has delivered them to my keeping. The waiting souls must be prepared. If sent north too quickly, they will perish in spirit, even if their bodies are saved. That is when her neighbors began noticing that the Mercer house had become a fortress of courtesy. Visitors were still received, but only in the front parlor. Adeline always appeared composed, still in black mourning silk, though more than a year had passed. She spoke softly, offered tea, mentioned grief, mentioned fragile nerves, mentioned household repairs. But no guest was allowed beyond the front hall. Doors that once opened toward the cellar corridor had been paneled over. Windows on the side of the kitchen yard were nailed shut from within. Supplies were delivered at night and taken around back by the few enslaved workers Adeline kept closest to the house. By 1853, the sounds had started. A neighboring clerk wrote of hearing singing from the Mercer property long after midnight. Not work songs, not dancing. Slow, sustained voices rising and falling beneath the sound of river insects. A doctor named Elias Trent called to the house in June of that year after Adeline sent for fever medicine, later wrote to his brother that he was permitted to examine only a single elderly woman in an upstairs room, though he distinctly heard coughing from below and what he described as the metallic clink of restraint. When he asked if there were sick laborers in the cellar, Adeline stepped between him and the back passage and told him the storage rooms were flooded with bad air and unsafe. He never returned. Then people began disappearing around Mercer Landing. Not all at once. Not in a way that forced the county to see a pattern, but one by one. A free black deckhand, known to carry messages upriver, vanished after boasting in a saloon that the Mercer widow knew how to move people past the patrols. A surveyor hired to redraw the lot lines near the levee failed to come back to Natchez after a day measuring the Mercer yard. An itinerant printer with anti-slavery sympathies was last seen asking directions to the landing. 2 enslaved men from neighboring properties were listed in reward notices as runaways, yet one merchant later swore he saw them unloading crates behind Adeline's freight shed weeks after those notices appeared. Each incident had its own explanation. Men disappear on rivers. Surveyors travel. Runaways get sold south under other names. Gossip rots facts. And still the widow's house kept changing. The cotton business visibly shrank. Mercer Landing no longer handled the traffic it once had, but Adeline's personal accounts did not collapse. Bank papers, later reviewed by a legal historian in the 1980s, showed small but regular deposits from Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Wheeling. Too small to attract public notice, too steady to be accidental. Money was reaching her. So were people. What no one outside the house knew was that the harbor below had stopped being a station and become a system. The excavation carried out in 1976 by preservation archaeologists found not a single hiding room, but a network. Brick chambers branching beneath the kitchen yard and part of the freight office. Ventilation shafts hidden inside ornamental drain urns. Water channels cut through packed clay. Speaking tubes running from Adeline's private study to 3 separate rooms below. Iron rings mortared into the walls. Not enough for heavy chains of the kind used in jails. Enough for ankle restraints. Enough to stop movement. Enough to make dependence physical. There were toys down there. A rag-wrapped doll, a bone whistle, marbles made from baked clay. There were cooking tins, blackened by repeated use, and blankets patched so many times the original fabric was almost gone. There were tally marks covering the walls in parallel strokes that no one could date precisely, but that no one mistook for decoration. This was not a place people passed through in a night or two. This was a place people were kept. And now we come to the part that makes the story harder to hold, because the evidence suggests that some people did in fact leave the harbor in the beginning. Liza Boone said that during the first year there were departures, small groups, quiet nights. People washed, fed, dressed in river clothes, then moved before dawn to skiffs or freight wagons headed away from Natchez. She remembered fear in the house, but also urgency, hope, the sense that terrible risk might still lead somewhere better. Then, in her words, the widow's mind turned inward. She started talking about readiness, about corruption waiting in the free states, about people who had escaped slavery in body, but were still shackled in soul. She began preaching below ground instead of merely feeding the hidden. She renamed the rooms with scriptural titles: Haven, Watch, Narrow Gate, Purging Room. A hand-drawn map found under a loose floorboard in her study included one chamber marked simply, Silence. Her journal from 1854 grows stranger by the page. They resist the discipline that will preserve them. The impatient mistake concealment for captivity. The Lord does not part the waters for those who have not learned obedience. That last line matters, because by then, obedience was no longer metaphorical. A survivor's notebook found in the same tin box as Adeline's map appears to have been written by a woman named Miriam, listed in a Mercer property inventory from 1848. The entries are short, cramped, and uneven, as if written in failing light. One sentence appears twice in different forms. She says, "This room is the road, but the road does not move." Another reads, "When she is kind, she speaks of north. When she is afraid, she locks the vent and calls it mercy." By 1855, the harbor had become a prison, run by a woman who still believed she was rescuing the people she confined. That is the horror at the center of the Mercer case. Not a simple sadist enjoying cruelty under a false name, though cruelty was there. Not a straightforward abolitionist martyr misunderstood by her time. Whatever mercy once existed, it curdled. The horror is that Adeline Mercer seems to have crossed the line from sanctuary to dominion so slowly, and with such certainty that she no longer recognized the difference. She fed those below. She medicated them. She preached to them. She punished them. and all the while she appears to have believed those acts belonged to the same mission. Liza Boone said the widow would descend with bread in one hand and a switch in the other. If someone begged to leave, Adeline called it panic. If someone defied her, she called it unpreparedness. If someone tried to flee inside the tunnels, ankle irons answered the problem. And when people died, her writings suggest she folded their deaths into the theology of the place itself. The surrendered have crossed beyond fear. The river receives what earth cannot keep. 4 people are believed to have died below Mercer House before the discovery in 1857, possibly more. Archaeologists found partial human remains in a sealed side chamber beneath the collapsed yard wall. The chamber was too small to live in comfortably, too deliberately cut to be accidental, and too close to the drainage channel for any decent burial. The end came because of fire. But not only fire. The summer of 1857 had been brutally hot. The river ran low and foul-smelling near the landing. Mosquitoes were thick. Warehouse laborers complained that the Mercer freight shed gave off a sweet, rotten smell after sundown. Then, on August 18th, sparks from a boiler stack on a neighboring press house caught in stored hemp and lamp oil. Flames jumped fast across the yard. Men arrived expecting an ordinary industrial fire. Instead, they heard voices from under the ground. The sheriff's official account says 14 persons of color were found in hidden chambers beneath the Mercer residence, some suffering illness and deprivation. The private letters tell it more plainly. Men crawling into brick passages, heat trapped in the walls, dust and smoke sucked downward by the vents. People blinking in lantern lights so weak from confinement they could not stand. A child clinging to a woman who could no longer lift her arms. Iron at the ankles of 2 men in the inner room. One elderly man on a pallet beside a basin of brown water. The smell. God, the smell. And Adeline? Witnesses agree on the strangest part. She did not run. She did not deny the chambers existed. She stood in the kitchen doorway, in her black dress with ash on the hem, and told the sheriff, with complete conviction, that the men below were under her protection and must not be removed until proper arrangements had been made. Proper arrangements. While the floor was collapsing around her, one witness said she looked furious, not that the people had suffered, but that her design had been interrupted. Another recalled her saying, "They were not ready. You have loosed them too soon." That sentence may be the clearest summary of what the harbor had become. You might think the discovery would have led to murder charges, newspaper outrage, public reckoning. It didn't. This was Mississippi in 1857, a world built on slavery, silence, reputation, and the protection of property. The idea that a prominent white widow had participated in any kind of escape network was scandal enough. The idea that she had turned that network into a private theological prison was worse. It threatened too many interests at once. So the matter was quieted. The surviving captives were not freed. Records suggest they were divided among 3 nearby properties and 1 county holding facility, under the language of temporary custody. After that, most disappear from the archive. Only 2 names can be followed with any confidence into emancipation papers a decade later. Liza Boone and a man called Abram, once listed as a teamster at the landing. Adeline Mercer was not tried in open court. She was declared unsound and transported to the state asylum at Jackson, with a diagnosis described in one ledger as religious derangement with dangerous fixations. She died there in February of 1858, 6 months after the fire. The attending physician recorded that she remained convinced to the end that she had failed a divine assignment. Her last reported lucid sentence was this: "I kept them from the river until the river came for me." After her death, a nephew from Hartford arrived to settle the estate. He spent one afternoon at Mercer House, emerged pale, and ordered the cellar mouths sealed with brick. The freight sheds were sold. The house stood for years, then decayed, then partially collapsed during another flood season. Families in the area warned children away from the ruins, but for decades the story itself thinned into fragments. A widow, a fire, voices underground. That was all most people said. What brought the fuller story back was not one document, but the collision of many. The Liza Boone interview, the Cincinnati letters, the excavation, the map with scriptural room names, the captive notebook, the bank transfers, the sheriff's sanitized report beside the unsanitized private letters of men who went below. And one more thing. During the 1976 dig, workers found a small brass shipping cylinder hidden in rubble beneath what had once been Adeline's study. Inside was a folded scrap of paper protected by wax cloth. The writing was faint, but enough survived to be read. "We are not cargo. We were 14 below her floor. If this is found, remember that waiting became another kind of chain. No signature. No date. No certainty about who wrote it. Only the voice of someone who understood the central lie of the place better than any historian ever could. That is why the Mercer story survives. Not because it gives us an easy villain or an easy martyr. Not because it flatters the living with the idea that we would have seen clearly where people of that time did not. It survives because it forces a more disturbing truth. A person can begin by helping the hunted and still end by loving the power to decide when, whether, and on what terms they are allowed to be free. A sanctuary can become a prison without changing its name. Mercy can become possession if the one giving it refuses to let go. And evil is often strongest when it speaks in the language of care. So when you hear stories about rescue, about protection, about someone insisting they alone know when another human being is ready for freedom, remember the widow at Mercer Landing. Remember the brick rooms. Remember the people who sang under the floor because it was the only way to hear one another in the dark. The river house is gone now. The landing changed hands, then industries, then silence. Cotton moved on. Timber came and went. The levee was rebuilt. The bricks sank. Reeds and willow took the riverbank back. But ground remembers pressure. Archives remember what people try to file away. And sometimes history leaves behind one sentence sharp enough to cut through a century of forgetting. We are not cargo. For the people beneath Adeline Mercer's house, that was the truth she could never finally understand. She thought she was building a harbor. What she built was a cage with scripture on the walls. And if there is any justice in memory, it belongs not to the widow who called herself their keeper, but to the voices below who refused to vanish, even after the house above them did.